Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about redefining the publishing landscape. You know, the publishing model most indie devs face is outdated and often stacked against them. Rigid contracts, hidden expectations, and the lack of real partnership forces devs to choose between full independence or giving up too much. But thankfully, a new approach is emerging. So, in this episode, we're going to explore what a modern publishing model looks like, one that's flexible, transparent, and built around the developer's long term success. We're going to unpack the rise of shadow publishing and the value of regional talent and what meaningful support really looks like in today's industry. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everyone, and we're back in today with us. I have Ben Kvalo. Ben, how is it going, man? And thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's going so well. It's a beautiful day in Wisconsin today. The warm weather has returned
Finally.
and I'm loving it. It's a lot happening in my world right now.
Awesome. All exciting stuff. And I'm sure we're going to get into some of it in a moment. But folks, for those of you who aren't familiar with Ben, he is the founder and CEO of Midwest Games and lots of great things that they're doing. And I would definitely want Ben to share in a moment what that is. But man, he's also has helped publish over 100 games and even 50 films at companies like Netflix, Blizzard, 2K. He launched and helped with the operations on Netflix games, a big influencer in part in that, and built cross-functional game publishing workflows, all sorts of stuff. And, helped publish games like Tomb Water, created Max Mraz, the Bloodborne demake, and a bunch of other things too. Lots of awards for, like a 2 times Golden Trailer Award winner and 6-time nominee for that. Lots of other organizations you're part of, but, Ben, I mean, we could probably go on really for quite a while with all your awesome accomplishments, but what is Midwest Games? And, please tell us about that and even some of your other initiatives that you're partaking in.
Yeah. It's been a winding career so far, and I hope it keeps winding. Midwest Games is a publisher at its heart, but ultimately we're looking at how publishing can be done a little bit different. So when I left Netflix to build Midwest, our initial piece of it was to challenge where games can come from and where games can get support. And if you look at where publishers are located in the United States, well, there's a huge gap right in the middle of the country. Not much there, not much support. And so we came out of the gates really saying, hey, there's a talent everywhere, but there's not opportunity everywhere. If we provide better support to folks in other places, we believe that we'll see more hits coming from those places. As we kind of went down the road with that, we also saw that there's a lot of opportunity around new systems, new ways of looking at the publishing end of the video game scope. And publishing makes a vast majority of revenue in the industry, like publishers. And yet it can be done very differently. And the industry for the last 30, 40 years has not changed. It's still very much what a publisher was back in the day when we were talking about physical publishing. And yet it's changed, especially since COVID.
Oh, yeah.
And so part of what Midwest Games is how do we create new models for publishing that better fit what developers do? The other things I do kind of on the side, I guess, I'm the president of Wisconsin Games Alliance, which is a nonprofit advocacy group trying to help push for more games industry and focus within Wisconsin and obviously the greater Midwest, because I think it all complements one another if we can all work together. As a part of that, I'm the executive chair of MDev, which is the largest game industry focused event in the Midwest. And really, outside of California, there's not much for
Yeah.
game industry focus, like,
Right.
B2B type of events. And so we host that every November. Next year's is November 7th and 8th. And that's just an incredible event. And I think something, for me, how do we make events more accessible to where developers are throughout the country, throughout the world? And GDC has become so expensive. We need some alternatives. And that, this event could be one of those alternatives. And we've seen it grow tremendously. I'm also a board member on a couple different organizations, the Wisconsin Academy of Science, Arts, and Letters, which focuses around creating civil discourse, like discussions, important discussions around science, art, and bringing those things together, which obviously video games is at the center of. And then I'm a board member of my university, UW Green Bay, as well, trying to help push forward some initiatives on their games programs and kind of just overall advice on what they could be doing from the academic end of things.
Wow, so much going on. And it's like music to my ears, and I'm sure a lot of you too, just the idea and concept of, hey, there's different ways to go about publishing and what that model looks like and what it really means and does for devs. And again, folks, like I said, we're going to dive in a lot more on that front too. So yeah, thanks so much for sharing a little bit more about that. And like I said, I'm excited to get into it. But before we do, we got to know you a little bit, but would like to get to know you a little bit more. And folks, how we do that here is through the Q Box round. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it's just a series of a couple random questions we got prepared here for Ben. So Ben, are you ready for the Q Box round?
I am so ready.
All right. First is, what's the most common mistake that you see devs or studios make with their games?
They do not think about they don't think about their market they are going to be aiming for at the beginning of the process, and then also work through the entire process and continue to do a market evaluation all the way through, because obviously games take time to make and the market changes so quickly in our industry that you have to be on top of how is that changing? How do I need to change my game to keep up? And making sure that the publishing idea is throughout the entire development process. It doesn't mean that you have all the publishing resources at every place process, but you're thinking about how you're going to market from the very beginning.
Very, very good point. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I see so less of that and nowhere near as much as it needs. So great point there. All right. Next is, what's your biggest gaming pet peeve?
One of my biggest, because I have many, is that people treat the video game industry as a monolith. Like they talk about something in mobile game space and acting like it reflects what is happening in PC or console or some of these other spaces. When in reality, if you look at the games industry holistically, each of these different spaces are essentially different industries at this point. Putting out a mobile game is a completely different process than putting out a PC game. And yet we generalize things and talk about publishing, and we talk about development, and we talk about game design and things like that, and we make these bold like claims about video games holistically, and we don't acknowledge that these are completely different things at this point. It is yeah, there's of course some crossovers, but there's crossovers between video games and films. That doesn't mean that they're the same. And so we have to start to segment out and acknowledge the differences between these things. And when you're a professional or expert, quote unquote, anyone that calls themselves an expert, I roll my eyes at. But if like you are that and you know a lot in one field, also realize that doesn't mean you know something in the other field. And too many people act like they do or think they do and don't acknowledge that it's so very different.
Yeah, no, those are great points. Because I see it too a lot. Like I've had people come to me and the way, like, with mobile games and stuff, and then the way that they talk about them too, I'm like, it's very different than what you might be thinking right now. And and I even say it's like, hey, I'm not an expert in mobile, but I know enough to at least guide these people. But at the same time, it's a very, very different landscape. You're different, like different player types, different strategies and tactics to use to, you know, like with marketing, there's so many different things. And that's just, and even the word marketing, right? How many people think of marketing as like this versus that, and they have their own ideas in their head when it encompasses so much. To, you know,
Well,
tap into your point.
and to that point, you look at, how does a mobile game succeed? And it's user acquisition and user acquisition strategies. And, like a lot of it is how do you go out there in some really bold way? I mean, you see some really ridiculous marketing in the mobile space, and then add on user acquisition practices on top of that. Whereas on the PC space, user acquisition, like paid user acquisition like that, is very different. In fact, doesn't really exist in a huge way. It's really hard to be efficient with user acquisition on the PC side of things from a paid perspective. And so it's just a completely different model with how you have to put out a game.
Yeah, exactly. Because acquisition or sorry, attribution doesn't really exist on that front. So, but among everything else, to your point, yeah, it's very different. All right, last but not least, and the staple here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
I am back to one of my favorite indie games, which is Space Haven. If you haven't played it, I'm a big fan of RimWorld and like resource management, colony management, simulation type games. And Space Haven's a spaceship, essentially builder management simulator, and it's just awesome. It's calming in a way, but also like you're jumping from place to place, gathering resources, building up your ship, managing it, balancing resources, all that kind of stuff. And so I love that kind of game. And so I always come back to it, and they've been developing. It's been an alpha for like 8 years or something like that, and it's in early access, and yet they continue to add things that keeps bringing me back year after year. So I usually go on a streak once every year playing that game.
Nice. Well, I really can appreciate and thank you enough, for sharing all that stuff. But now let's get right into the conversation. And like I said in the intro, folks, we're here to talk about how we're redefining, or ways that we can redefine the publishing landscape. And, to kick things off, Ben, I mean, from your view, what is broken about the current state of publishing for indie developers?
What is broken is we are operating still like it is 10 years ago. And the entire landscape has changed so dramatically. 10 years ago, well, I think it was 11 years ago at this point, there was 300 games coming out on Steam a year.
Yeah.
Last year there was 19,000. I think there's going to be 25,000. That's my bet this year. We'll see if I'm correct on that. But it is a completely different world, and consumers are different. Their playing habits are different. Competition is greater, and your games aren't just competing against games. One of my favorite quotes from when I was at Netflix, Reed Hastings said, "Disney is not our biggest competition. Fortnite is," which means for Fortnite, their biggest competition is Netflix. And so if we think about, the competition in market to get someone's attention and then convert them into somebody that wants to play a game, it is extremely tough. And the platforms have not kept up with the scale that is needed. And so if we really go down to it, it's that platforms have changed, and the consumer has changed on the platform, and the scale of games have changed, but the platforms at its core essence have not changed, and publishing practices have not changed. Publishers still operate like like we're taking games to store shelves, and that is just not the case anymore. Even though some still do, right? Like some of the biggest games, Walmart, Target, they still sell games. People still buy them. And that can be a good amount of business for some of these larger publishers. But right now, the publishing piece of things essentially doesn't bring the value that it used to bring. Publishers used to own that pipeline into those places, and now anyone can put out a game on Steam. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to succeed. Publishers still make the vast majority of revenue on these places, but there is that option now to be able to put your game without a publisher's help out to the consumer.
Yeah. And I love how you kind of like painted that perspective with that quote, because I know we've said this on the show before about like things changing and stuff, and again, I think what you just shared really speaks to the other ideas of time, like the valuing a player's time, because you're not just competing with other games and stuff, you're competing with other games that are already well established and popular from like a decade ago. You're competing with other platforms such as like streaming services, you're competing with family time. Like yep. These are the things that we're up against. But if entities such as like publishers are really just focusing on, hey, it worked 10 years ago and it's still getting a result, then why change it? But if that's the mentality being led, and let's say it probably has a cascading effect, and then we think the same way, like, oh, well, if they're just focus on this, then maybe I should just do the same thing. And it's like, but if we're all doing the same thing when everything else is changing, how's it going to help out?
Yeah, we're in a massive disruption moment. We are on the verge of a couple of these giants either collapsing or getting acquired or changing everything about them. I mean, we saw Ubisoft has now essentially moved their IP outside of their business so that they can protect it from the fact that Ubisoft as a business, I don't think is going to survive. And so you see people are starting to make the moves, realizing that this is about to really blow up in a big way. And already people are like, whoa, the industry is like blowing up. And I'm like, we haven't seen anything yet. We are ripe for massive disruption. There's new companies that are going to come in and come up with some unique way to do this that is going to work so much better. And they are and the EAs, the Take-Twos, the big companies that are stuck in the old ways of things are going to struggle to adapt. I mean, EA just announced that they aren't doing remote work anymore and things like that. They're all like doubling down on what they know from the past. Meanwhile, there's new innovative startups that are getting funded and pushed forward despite funding being down overall, that are going to be the next wave of giant companies. I look at it like, if we think about the history of how all this changes in many sectors, in the tech sector, you look at the dominance of Microsoft and Apple for a while, and then Google came out of nowhere and really disrupted things. And that forced the giants to change or die. And a couple companies died in that moment, and others shifted. Like Microsoft, as much as it's still a little bit of what it always has been, it also got a little bit more progressive. It learned from what Google was doing. It had to compete. And the good businesses will do that. So some of these will survive, but others will absolutely crash and burn in this moment, which is really going to be fascinating to watch, as just like it interested in the industry type of thing, but it's going to cause a lot of chaos, but with chaos comes a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm kind of curious too, because we talked about this a moment ago, but from your perspective, like, I'm sure there's still a lot of people, and I don't think the sentiment is completely like 100% there. I think it's definitely been shifting over time. But like, why do you think like, a lot of developers might just kind of underestimate, behind the scenes publishing and how it can kind of like, make or break, and more particularly, they focus on it could really make their launch. Like, why do you think that behavior is still there, that they still feel, hey, if I just get a publisher and that mentality, and everything will be okay?
Yeah, I think there's a lack of understanding of what a publisher is, what a publisher provides, and what a publisher's priorities are. And it skews things. Like if you find a good publisher with good terms, and they really support your title through launch, it's probably an incredible experience. And there's plenty of developers that have had incredible experiences with publishers. There's others that maybe didn't get great terms, had a bad experience, or maybe didn't get the support because guess what? A publisher knows that they need a portfolio of titles. And one or two out of 20 or 10, depending on what their philosophy and strategy and what the market they're going after, one or two will succeed and the rest won't. And so whoever those one or two that's trending in that direction, they're going to get the most support. And it's not from the standpoint of the people in the publisher not caring about all the games. They actually really do. It's from the model is designed to only support the things that have the best chance of success. And that doesn't necessarily translate to what actually does succeed or could succeed in market, but that's how they're built. And they've had tremendous success with that model, and they continue to. So why, as a publisher, would you adjust? And for developers, because they've never really been in a publisher, and so few have. Like, let's just think about the numbers of this and why this publishing is so misunderstood and people don't understand what it is. It's because there's only about 200 to 300 publishers worldwide, actual full-scale publishers. I'm not talking about a marketing agency that pretends like they're a publisher, or a developer that's doing self-publishing and then they help their buddy publish their game and they call themselves a publisher. That's not a publisher. It's awesome, and it can work, but that is not what a full scope publisher is. A full scope publisher is providing a ton of strategic resources, production resources, marketing resources, and then developer resources connecting for porting or co-dev or art outsourcing or whatever is needed ultimately. And they have all four of those things all working together. And if we think about only 200 to 300 publishers, and the reality is, even if you happen to be somebody that has worked in a publisher, there's not many of those because publishers tend to be smaller groups in comparison that scale across many games. So there's not many of them. And even if you have worked in it, you're likely siloed into your segment of the publisher. So you're in the marketing piece, or you're in the production piece, and you're in the strategy piece, or you're providing developer services. Now, they all have to work together, but they only know their piece the most. Very, very few people have ever worked across all four pieces at one time and understood how they all work together and why each of those pieces help to build out a successful launch, a successful company. And so it's just a matter of numbers. And also look at education. We have so many schools that teach video game development now, or software development, or other aspects that allow for video game development. Name one school that has a video game publishing degree.
Nope.
Can't do I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. And so, my sell to universities, including my own, is like, okay, you want to get into video games? Why not do the thing that is so vital right now and teach that thing to folks? Because as a developer, yeah, you can go to university, teach these things, but also developers are learning that before they ever go to college. Yeah, they're learning that when they're much younger now. They're getting a lot of those skills without ever having to go to some formal education. Now, formal education will make you vastly better at all of those things, and I highly encourage it, but not everyone can afford it. And it's not an absolute necessity. But what is a necessity to succeed in market is to understand how to evaluate your market and how to go to market and all the pieces that are involved with doing that. And we don't have any education in anywhere around this whole publishing piece that is so incredibly vital to a game succeeding in market.
Yeah, it's funny you say that too, because recently I was attending PAX and I spoke with a university about that thing. Is I was just curious, hey, what do you have for other, curriculum courses about, business and marketing as it relates to gaming? And they're like, nothing. And I'm sure there's a lot of universities and colleges out there that are looking to build upon that, but it's still, it's like, I don't know. And hey, I went to film school, right? And I learned, that's my whole little mini journey story is like, I went to film school and realized as an independent filmmaker, you need to learn how to market yourself. And then I made a career in marketing, right? But that was never taught in school. Like, I learned the most business information from a single course, which was from a local documentary filmmaker. And even though it wasn't what I was focusing on, that's where I learned a lot. But still, I mean, it brings up a lot of interesting points about the importance of understanding these things. And like you let in and said initially, it really comes down to, when we're thinking about publishing, it really comes down to really understanding all the components that are related, not just the few that some publishers, focus on. Not just that, because when you have a better understanding, it doesn't just teach you, the marketing about it, the porting. It, teaches you how to be a better company and things like that. And those are all great points you called out to.
Well, and I think the biggest piece of this is it's cross-functional, like it's cross-departmental. And that's one of the biggest challenges is, trying to get a university, for example, to across different departments with different deans of each of these places to come together, create a curriculum that crosses between all of their different fields and brings them together to work together. Getting that in a university setting, if you're familiar at all with universities, is so incredibly hard.
Oh yeah, lots of red tape.
and it's incredibly hard in a professional environment, except that games, it's a requirement. We have to work across departments. Game developers do, like engineers have to work with artists. And those are oftentimes folks that sometimes speak different languages, even though they're speaking English, let's say in the US. And yet you have to figure that out, because that is what makes the beauty of a game. That is what allows for it to become such an incredible, engaging, entertaining medium, is that you have this blend of things that are incredibly hard to blend. And yet we do this as a profession. Like, we are really good at blending things. And a publisher has to do the same thing, blend all of these things. And again, it's so hard to blend that. And that is why people don't have the skills until they go out into the environment and have to do it themselves and figure it out. And some people do figure it out and they become really, really good at it. But a lot of folks, they don't want to figure it out. They don't want to do all that. They're focused on their one area, and that's what they're really good at. And then it takes, folks like producers that help to navigate and bring all these groups together. And so that's a big piece of it, is just how difficult it is and how our society is not really great at blending these very diverse skill sets into one thing and bringing people from many different backgrounds into one thing. But that's the power of video games.
Yeah. And I mean, it's funny because as you're saying that, like, I see that too. Lots of people don't want to focus on these other things because they don't understand it as well or whatever. And then probably just takes us right back to the question is, why do they underestimate or not realize like what's going on a publishing front? And because they're like, oh, this will solve my problem of me not wanting to do these things. We talked a lot about like what these things look like, the different components and how important it is to share. And a lot of that too is part of like that broken model as you talk about like, hey, it's the 80-20 rule. And if, 20% or whatever is making 80% of our revenue, then we focus on these things, right? So we have some basic understandings of this current model. Well, how does the model that you're working towards, kind of like let devs retain more control while still getting like, support and an understanding of probably a lot of these things you just mentioned?
Yeah. So there's multiple prongs to enable the kind of model that we're doing actively and seeing some really great early success around. Is first off, by readjusting where we're working. We are operating in Wisconsin, which is at a fraction of the cost of operating in California. So we are, compared to the industry average, which California's average is above the industry average, obviously, but compared to the industry average in the US, we are operating at 30% of the cost. And so that allows us to consider different models and different ways of working that someone in California, where they have to earn so much above and beyond just to operate there, they can't consider a model like what we're doing with shadow publishing. So yeah, what we've created is this for hire model, which we coined shadow publishing, that allows for us to essentially get hired on, similar to like a codev, hired on as a resource, which that is what publishing is we are a support resource for game developers. And we can provide all of these four pillars that I've spoken about, and we don't have to take rev share, IP rights, or string developers up in some kind of long-term agreement. And so, because why we can do that is the risk associated with a publisher comes with the fact that a publisher is investing time, money, effort upfront and hoping for a return on the back end. So there's a lot of risk, a ton of risk. In my model, it flips it on its head, where the risk is on the developer side, which the risk already was on the developer side. When there's a publisher developer model, the risk shifts to the publisher, which is why a publisher then takes so many rights and control. If we keep the risk with the developer and we can provide a resource and support services at a cost-effective rate, they can budget, plan for it, and be able to move forward, keep their rights, which allows them, if they succeed in market, which we help them to do, they then can build a sustainable studio over time that isn't owned or connected to or forced to work with somebody that they don't know. They're able to essentially build everything they need internally and think about that kind of longer term roadmap, and then have a flexible resource like us to come to whenever they need it. Not that they are always have to be with us, and they also have to listen to us, and then they don't have control over the things that they're building. So it keeps the creative control with the developer, which I always want the creative control with the developer. But we also then provide significant feedback from a non-biased perspective. When you're invested in something and you own a piece of something, you sometimes get a bit biased on it because you're trying to force something to work because you're invested in it, rather than looking at something in a non-biased way and saying, but this isn't working. Like, I get you want it to work, but that market you're going after is not there anymore. Or it's changed dramatically. And so this system is not for everybody. Obviously, you have to be able to afford it. So our starting price is $5,000 a month from a monthly retainer. We do a hourly rate as well if ultimately a developer wants that instead. But it allows for them to get access to all these publishing resources, and obviously scales up. If there's a large amount of work, depending on the game, depending on the resources needed, all that kind of stuff, it scales up to probably $30K or more, depending on what it is, but you have to budget for it. But you do the calculation side by side, and by paying for those services up front, you potentially retain millions, well, hundreds of thousands to millions to tens of millions, if the game really succeeds, of dollars that you're not giving to a publisher. And then for us, we're there as a resource. If we do good work, you're going to want to continue to work with us. If we're solving problems and helping you, you're going to want to continue to work with us. So it creates sustainability on our end as well, and reduces our risk, and allows us to give a developer a chance to create a sustainable business.
You know, there's some kind of interesting things that I'm seeing in this model too, where, like, I don't know why this stood out so much, but like, even the budget and planning, like how many times do we not really think about, how to properly budget things? How do we account for, our in-kind costs, right? Or what time we're putting it and actually valuing our time. And like, just something as simple as this with a model like this allows you to kind of focus on that more in terms of like projections. What is something you would like to do that's considered as like break even, not just a nice number to have type situation. And what is this? This is also leads into other like basic business concepts. Like, hey, if you're in a position where you get revenue, it's successful, but don't just look at revenue, look at what is the net
Yep.
that you're bringing. Like, and I think a lot of these things start happening. And what's really cool too is, you mentioned something too about this bias. If someone's putting, let's say, they call it like skin in the game and stuff, right? But then I been in situations where I considered this type of stuff before, and then looking back now, I'm like, wow, knowing that I have X number of skin in the game, right? Then all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, let's make it work. And then I could see how going through that process in my head, now you're starting to act, or people could start to act irrationally or just be reactive to a situation opposed to something that actually is going to have some type of impact, and these are things that folks that we don't really ever think about. And even if we do, then there's this emotional sides that get involved in stuff. But here, it allows you, I think, to get a little bit more invested with this process, to look at things in a different way. So there's just so much more, again, it's not for everybody. It sounds like there's so much more that people can benefit from it, leading up to what you're calling out is the sustainability of things, which I think is important, and a lot of values and skills that we don't tend to think about, as what you're creating here isn't just a game and something fun. It's also a business.
Well, and I think a big key to successful development, whether you're working with a publisher or not, is feedback. You feedback from your community, feedback from others around you, others you trust, others that are not familiar with it. You want a lot of feedback, and the less biased the feedback, the better. And that this ultimately creates it from a key component of the process, but you also want it from other angles. Like if you bring your kids in to do user testing and then they love the game, who cares? Like if that is not your consumer market necessarily. Now it could be.
Yep.
You could accidentally, get that, but that is not a good way to approach it holistically. It allows all these developers also to just really think about the business that they're building. Too often, a publisher takes the business off the shoulders of the developer, and the developer never develops their ability to run a business.
Yeah.
And that is a thing that we need developers to be more savvy around, is to be entrepreneurs that are building a long-term business off of an idea that has a market opportunity. And it's a tough thing because it's a creative field. It's the same as film, the same as others. Some people will be like, that's not a business. And yet it might be. It just might not be. It might be a future market that is unknown. So it's a little bit hard on that end of things. But if people are more savvy thinking about the business of games and what you're actually building, what you're setting up to eventually be able to be sustainable, how you're reinvesting dollars, not that you're like, oh, big success, I'm going to, go buy a bunch of cars, that, and waste a bunch of money, when you should be reinvesting dollars in, paying yourself a healthy salary, but like also think about all the other things you need involved in the process, and making sure that you have the runway to get to and through the next game as well with the dollars that you earn. And too often people, they have one success and then blow it, and then it's gone, and then the studio can't survive ultimately. And so that's the part that I'm excited about, is just getting developers more to a point of like they're running successful businesses, and we are a tool that they can use to run that successful business.
Yeah. And, one thing I want to call it too, which is something I see with, a lot of the people that I work with too, and call out to them too. It's, as it relates to marketing, at least, I never like it when you have some people that are like, oh, just hands off, manage this and give me some like check. And it's like, no, like to make this work for you for long term, it's really about having a pulse on things. At the very least, you don't have to be an expert in these things, but at least having a pulse, having an understanding of these things, because that way you're going to be better prepared to make better decisions in the long run. But if you get in that mentality, kind of like what we talked about earlier about, hey, we'll just hand it off to the publisher, that's not anything that's going to help you out in the long run.
Well, and we see it with how the current environment is in order to have success in market. The folks that the developers front and center in communications with their community, they tend to have more success. And so we need developers to be at a major piece of the communications and community work and marketing. Now, what a publisher does is helps you scale it and helps you manage it and helps takes the weight off of all the things you have to do to manage a community and relationship and creates entry points to put the developer front and center, but it's all planned. It's not just random. Now random can work. Like we know in games random can work, but more often than not random does not work, and people very conveniently ignore that 19,000 games came out and yet only 300 succeeded commercially. And they point to one of the 300 and they go, well, look, that one did it.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, wait, there's there's 18,700 that didn't do it. And you're going to only point towards the ones that did it. And so it more often than not works by putting your developer front and center to their community. They then can engage and show how they care about whether it be the genre or the style game they're doing or whatever it is, whatever your selling point is. It helps to authentically engage your audience, and that allows you to ultimately have a chance with that community, because then you create advocates because they feel the passion, they understand it, they become fans of you as a developer. And if you have a fan as you as a developer, then you get a forever fan of the games that you make.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's always what we want to, strive for and stuff. But, I think part of it too, and what you just said there, is a lot of the times when we're doing these things, we're so focused on the outcomes that we forget how important the process actually is to obtain the outcomes, obtain the results. We talked a lot about the current model, how yours is changing things and everything else. I mean, in light of this, how do you see the landscape, the publishing landscape changing in the next few years? Because honestly, we are in a very interesting and yes, hard, but very interesting time where there's a lot going on. How do you see this shift or these things evolving in this landscape?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I basically started by saying the old way of publishing has to essentially change and die. There's going to be a lot of companies that die, but part of what I see moving forward is publishing services, all the things around publishing is going to be more vital than ever moving forward. When you have such an insane volume of content coming out, the things that will help you stand out are what publishers do. And so statistically, publishers and anything that has publishing services attached to it will continue to dominate the landscape from a revenue standpoint. Yeah, we'll still have some, slight successes, but the data continues to point towards publishers always win. Less than 2% of games have a publisher on Steam, and they just initial units sold, they sell between 67 and 78%. And if you look at microtransactions, additional content, all that stuff, which publishers do at a much higher rate than an indie developer, you're talking 90+% of revenue is generated by less than 2%. So publishers are going to continue to dominate. How publishing is done is going to change dramatically. A lot of publishers will go out of business. New models will have to be created, and platforms are going to change dramatically. They're already in the midst of changing. They're changing now because of legal challenges. Epic versus Apple and Google has changed the landscape on the mobile space. What I think that will lead to is more storefronts, and it already is leading to this. And I also think a change in how mobile is consumed. I think free to play is not that it's going to die. There will absolutely always be some big free to play giants on the mobile space. But I think premium games coming into mobile now that devices can actually handle them, cloud gaming, all this kind of stuff that is happening that can happen on mobile is going to become much more prevalent. And so that is all going to change pretty dramatically. And the publishers and how they put out those games are going to change. And then we're seeing it with, Roblox and, Fortnite, Unreal Engine, all of this kind of stuff where publishers can't really go into that landscape because the rev share model is so skewed towards the platform. Yet we're seeing a lot of development in that space. So I think that's going to become the entryway for a lot of young developers to eventually graduate to larger development platform, like more hardcore development platforms, I should say, more code focused development platforms over time. But at the same point, Epic wants to create their walled garden. They want everyone on Epic Game Store. So will they succeed in that? I don't think so long term. I think there's cycles with all of this. Yes, Fortnite's dominated for a long time, but Fortnite will not forever dominate. There will be other things. And when that starts to change, there's going to be a lot of disruption. Maybe it's when GTA comes out. Maybe
whenever that happens.
Whenever that happens. But maybe at that point, people start to graduate from Fortnite or from Roblox. Probably not Roblox because it's much younger.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows, right? I mean, we played GTA at young ages, growing up. Who knows? Or is GTA actually being overvalued right now? I don't know. It's going to be really fascinating to see what happens in that moment.
Yeah. I mean, but you know what? Best thing you could do is probably not focus so much on where things going to go and stuff in such a big context either. Is just, I don't know, focus on yourself sometimes too. I digress a little bit here, but I know sometimes some of us get so caught in all the everything else that's going on. And sometimes it's just good to, focus on yourself and how are you improving things and keeping up with the times within means. You don't need to know everything.
Well, and it's a great point. It also goes into what I'm excited about is people coming with new ideas to solve problems.
Yeah.
Like actual problems that are happening. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of new kinds of companies that will grow into the future giants come from. And so it's focus on solving one of these many problems that we have. And you might end up opening up into solving a much grander problem. I even go back to think about Netflix's history.
Mm.
They did not start as trying to be some big giant streaming service. They started by solving a problem. And the problem was how you distribute to an audience that wanted a bit more of a convenient way of receiving their entertainment. How do you distribute it faster or more conveniently than what was being done at the time, where you had to go out and get this and select something.
Brick and mortar video stores.
Yeah, and when they solved that, they suddenly opened up a gate to a bunch of other problems they were starting to be able to solve. And then it opened up the gate of, okay, well, what if we did it completely differently and really just solve the problem of making it super convenient to watch this entertainment. And so, but they started by solving one problem and it led to all these other opportunities. And so I think in the same space I'm excited about right now, where somebody could solve one problem here in games and it could open up a ton of other avenues to solve problems that exist in how do we serve games to consumers and serve the games that they actually want to be playing, not the ones that are just the most expensive that make the most for the platform. And we don't have a curation platform for players. We have a curation platforms for publishers and platforms right now so that they can make the most amount of money. What I'm fascinated about is a platform in the future that is focused purely around the player, whether the game is 99 cents, free, $70, they're serving the game the player would actually want to play in that moment. That's what I'm really excited about in this next wave.
Yeah. And people are working on that. Forget the episode number, but Ichiro Lamb is, I know, trying to come up with this, working on a solution for that right now. But there's other, I'm sure there's other people's in that space too, and it's a big one. But still, I mean, I love that point too, because that's something I firmly believe on, is like, you know, a lot of the stuff we do is it's our own passions, drives, motivations and stuff, which is all great. But we, a lot of times, and I think it goes back to your, one of the pet peeves is like people not doing like enough market research in the concept stage of a game, is because we don't focus on players as much as I think we should be, putting ourselves in their shoes, really understanding them as a whole, as your audience, and, you know, catering the best that you possibly can to them. Once we start doing that and finding other creative ways of doing it, lots of interesting things are going to happen.
Yep.
You know, to kind of start wrapping things up here, because I know this is a big one, and in different ways on the podcast here, we've covered kind of like this as a whole topic with a couple of guests, but like in particular with you, you know, why has the Midwest, and let's even say other underrepresented regions, been overlooked? And I mean, I think we have an idea of how that can change, but, you know, any other examples of that too?
Yeah. So it's something I've thought about obviously a lot, because my company is based a little bit around it. But a big piece of it is, it used to be we had to go to wherever that hub was.
Yeah.
We had to go to San Francisco or LA or Seattle, or even Austin, Texas became a bit of that as an alternative hub for games. And there's very little outside of it. And so as Midwesterners, ever since Midway went out of business in 2009, there was no hub in the Midwest that had that kind of giant company. And, you know, there's some exceptions to this, you know, like Epic, North Carolina, like that's a bit of an exception to this rule. But otherwise, you had to go to San Francisco, you had to go to LA, you had to go to Seattle.
Yep.
And that was partially because of where technology was at. It wasn't easy to be able to work remote at that time period. And also our habits just in no way were based around that. And so everyone would go to those hubs because it was a requirement.
Yep.
And so I think with that, there became this idea that talent was in those places. Like that was where the talented people were. When in reality, talent is everywhere. Some of that talent could go and could afford to, or their lifestyle allowed them to move to those hubs. Other talent could never do that. And maybe they didn't go into some of the careers or get the same experiences as this other talent, but that doesn't mean that they're not talent. That doesn't mean that they couldn't develop into something or don't have the skills to do the thing anyways. It just means they are perceived as not being able to do it because they didn't go to a certain location with a certain group of people. Now, that is completely wrong. And also, like, if you've ever worked, anybody that's ever worked at these larger companies in California knows that no one is from California, or there's very few locals that they come from everywhere else. And what I felt being the Midwestern, and I think Midwest has a kind of an interesting, unique like pride to it, especially Wisconsin. Wisconsinites just love to talk about Wisconsin and the cheese and the beer and the brats and the culture and the everything. Like Wisconsinites just have this really amazing pride for it that it sometimes gets a little bit toxic because like, okay, yeah, like I love Wisconsin, but it's not the best.
There's only so much I could talk about cheese.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could talk about cheese all day, but it's like, it's an amazing, incredible place. And there's one of many amazing, incredible places throughout the world. And you should visit many of them. And what I saw in these companies was the fact that these people that I was working with, it felt like half of them were from the Midwest. And I was like, wait a sec, why are we all out here doing this in an expensive place? And it all comes down to that's where it's always been done. But anytime someone goes, oh, well, that's how it's always been done, it's ripe for disruption. And
Yep.
COVID kicked off a massive change because obviously we had to learn to work remote. We found out actually you're more productive when you work remote. All the data shows it's actually better to work remote with some exceptions, so certain fields, certain careers, like, of course, and there should be moments to come together as well. But all the data shows it's better to do remote. And guess what? The migration patterns. Check out the data around migration patterns 2020 to 2022. Guess where people went and guess where people left. People left LA, they left San Francisco, they left Seattle, and they went to the middle of the country. They went to lower cost places. They went to back to where they were from. And all of that completely changed, what is happening. And so many of those people are now in these places. And I see it when I host a social in Green Bay and almost 300 people show up to the social. And it's not just enthusiasts, it's people working at giant companies. They're kind of like doing it a little bit secretly because they don't want to like talk or brag about it too much. But they are working in these places because this is where they're from. This is where they want to be. And what's the stat? Like 70% of people would rather lose their job than go back. And that tells me we're in the midst of a massive change. Now, there's going to be a lot of chaos, like I mentioned with EA now forcing in person.
Yeah. Yeah.
But ultimately, I think what will happen is there'll be some new companies created in these places. And then they're going to become very attractive because these people want to be in these places. And I found it with my own company where I found just top-notch talent, like top of the top, and they're right here in Wisconsin.
Yeah. Yeah. It really puts things into perspective too. It's like, because again, with how accessible things are, the entry to barrier for learning these skills, this technology and everything else, it's all here around you and stuff.
Yep.
And you said this, and I think I'm paraphrasing it a bit here, but I love this. Basically, your quote, which is saying like, if it's always been done this way, it just means you can disrupt it. So I don't know. Take that for what it's worth, folks, in whatever capacity, however you apply it, because it's so true. So think outside of that box. If it's always been done this way, and then tell yourself, well, if that's the case, that means I can disrupt it. I can make it something that stands out. Anyway, sorry.
No, and what's what is also awesome is a lot of times it is purely perception. Did you know that Call of Duty, Apex Legends, PUBG, part of Elder Scrolls Online, part of Diablo 4, WWE 2K, all of those games are partially or fully developed in Madison, Wisconsin. Oh, Dungeons and Dragons, you know where that was invented? Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And people don't realize these things and where they come from. Bungie, as a studio, originated in Chicago. It's now in Seattle, obviously, but it moved. So many of these giant things that we look at today, you have to go back historically and see where they came from. See the people that they came from. Like it's pretty incredible. Steve Jobs' parents met at UW-Madison. It's pretty funny seeing some of those like connections back. I always joke to my team, especially the ones that like live outside of the Midwest, have some connections back, but like don't quite understand it. Cause I'm like, when you say you're from the Midwest, like everyone has a connection. Everyone has some kind of connection back, whether it be family or friends, or they have that, their good friend that's from Wisconsin that wears a cheese head everywhere. Their dad came from the area or something like that. It's really funny to see how many people have that connection back and really have some kind of affinity to it because they're like, they remember coming back to visit their grandparents or other things. And because it's a delightful place to be. And now they're like, whoa. And guess what? You can buy a house for under $300,000. Like, and not only just like a house, like a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom, and on an acre of land.
Yeah, it's crazy. So there's, again, so many opportunities like in your backyard. Talent, people, everything. So awesome stuff. Well, I know we're coming on time here, so man, Ben, we talk so much, lots of great things here. If there was any like, takeaways, tips, whatever from our conversation today, what would the main ones be that you'd call out?
Yeah, so I would call out always be studying the market. Don't underestimate publishing and everything that goes into going to market and all the capabilities you need to be able to do it. First time anyone ever goes through the release management process with a platform, they'll understand this is a very painful thing. And there's a reason why there's folks that are experts in that area. And then finally, you have to be willing to be adaptable in this market. It is going to continue to change. What I've been telling people is if you haven't published a game in the last 2 or 3 years, you have no idea the market that you're dealing with these days. It has completely changed the last couple of years. And you can't take the old ways of doing things and expect yourself to succeed. Now, somebody will do it and they'll succeed, but statistically, most will not. And so you have to adapt. You have to be willing to change. You have to be willing to do something truly unique and different. And you have to be always exploring those new avenues. And don't be afraid to fail. Like failure is not a permanent thing. It allows you to learn a lesson, adjust, grow, try something new, and then continue that cycle. And you'll find the thing that will help you stand out, and then focus on that, spend money against that. At that point, really go into whatever that thing is that is working. And as a piece of that, making from an adaptability standpoint, adjust your budgets. Keep asking for 3 million, 10 million, 50 million these days, you're not going to get it. Like people are developing games for less than $500,000. And if you're trying to go get money and you're pitching for a $5 million game, you're not going to get it. It's so incredibly unlikely these days. And so adapt to the market that we're in, and you have an opportunity to break through when others are not adapting.
Yeah. Like, smaller projects, faster timelines for the development, build up that portfolio and there's lots of ways to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that world's gone. I just think that the idea of you getting that kind of money when it's lower cost, easier from a tooling perspective, to get something built, you're just not going to get the money that you used to, and the economics don't work. Like if you go through the publishing economics and the development economics of a $10 million game in today's world, it just doesn't work. It's too risky. And so it's very unlikely, unless somebody doesn't know games and is willing to give you money, which still is happening.
Yep.
It's very unlikely that somebody that understands games will give you money.
Yeah. So Ben, I can't thank you enough. There's so many great pieces of advice there and tips, everything else. Thank you. And, hey, folks, as we close here, Ben, it's been an honor. If people want to connect with you, learn more about Midwest Games, please drop us some links. Let us know how they can connect.
Yeah, I mean, it's easiest. Our website's midwestgames.com. Yeah, pretty straightforward on that front. We do a lot on LinkedIn, a lot on TikTok. Check out our TikTok. Jazz, who runs a lot of our social content and creation, that does a lot of really fun things, especially around Tomb Water right now and the Legend of Babu. So check out our TikTok. But yeah, pretty much Midwest Games anywhere. Sometimes we have to put Midwest Games Co. because somebody stole or did steal, but got to Midwest Games before we did. But it's pretty much Midwest Games anywhere. And then you can follow us on our Steam page. Like if you look up Midwest Games on Steam, you can follow us as a publisher page, which then allows you to kind of get updates across all of our titles that we have, deals coming up, all that kind of stuff. And we have a couple other exciting things that we're going to be launching pretty soon here as well.
Awesome. So folks who heard it, if you're interested to reach out, connect, learn more, midwestgames.com. Ben, it's been awesome to have you. on the show and share all your insights. Can't thank you enough, man.
Appreciate being here. Appreciate the time.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.